Thank you. Good morning. How can there be an analyst without a presentation behind? So I'm going to be using slides unlike Mr. Bharani and Kiran because there were some really great speeches. But good to meet all of you. Good morning again. Can I have my slides, please? And while they're coming up, I wanted to say, I want to actually convey big thanks to all of you in the industry who have managed to work through some really difficult times that we all have seen in last 2 years and have come out on top. So great job. Just give big round of applause to yourself. And I hope all of you are staying safe because even though we seem to be somewhat out of woods, things are likely to fluctuate. Believe it or not, in last 2 years, I was telling folks, this is going to be my first speech on stage, which is so uncommon. So if I'm a bit rusty, just bear with me. All right. So let me get started. Today I'm going to talk about how partnerships are evolving and what does it mean for different sets of providers, be it the services providers, be it the GCC or the captives that operate out of cities such as Hyderabad and various cities in India, as well as different technology providers. So I'm going to try to kind of address how the world around us has shifted and is going to shift as we move towards, say, next 5 odd years, and what does it mean for all of you. And this is something we believe is very, very important, and we call it the future of partnerships. But before I get started, let me share some interesting anecdotes that I'm very fond of. Just like you guys, just like the industry here and the industry participants here, airline industry, which happens to be one of my favorite industry because I worked very closely with some of them in my previous life, I was noting how they were coping with the changes that they were experiencing. And I came across some really interesting stories. For example, when every flight was stopped, no airline was flying, companies such as Etihad decided to be very, very smart about it, and they invested a lot of time in maintaining their big fleet of planes, which actually consumes a lot of time. So when it comes to when it comes the time to fly again, they could actually fly without interruptions, right? And they saved a lot of money in the process. Some airlines converted these passenger flights to freighters. We were kind of, when I was watching the story last year, I was jealous of, these boxes which were sitting in places where we should have been sitting, right? And then airlines such as Qantas, ANA, Singapore Airline, and many others across the globe did some really amazing things. They ran restaurants in their planes. They actually flew flight to nowhere. For example, Qantas took a flight from Sydney, went around different sightseeing points in Australia and landed back at Sydney just to give passengers the flavor of, what flying was so they don't forget. All of these stories basically tell us that the industry was trying to be three things. They were trying to be resilient in the face of pandemic and the uncertainty that was staring in their eyes. They were trying to be adaptive and they were trying to be creative. And this has become very, very important. In our research, we found that companies are realizing that they need to be more resilient. 68% of the firms believe that resiliency is very, very important for them. 84% of the firms believe that they wish that their leaders were actually more adaptive. They could create a more adaptive firm. 78% believe creativity is going to be very, very important for them. And I'm going to kind of touch upon these 3 points as I go forward as to what do we mean by that. But one thing that we realize that this response is not new. This response has been in the making for last many years. In fact, for last 10 odd years, we found that the tech investments that the companies were making started diminishing in their returns. All the productivity gains that tech used to provide to firms had started to come down by the end of 2010s. And as a result, firms were wondering whether the digital investments that they were making are going to be leading to any meaningful ROI. In addition to the tech investment and tech productivity falling, what we found that the customer experience was becoming very stale. All companies were kind of looking very similar. The very similar banking app, very similar technology apps from airlines and media companies and whatnot. There was very little differentiation. And on top of that, over the last many years, all of these firms had accumulated huge amount of technology debt, which is essentially them not investing in emerging technologies, not investing and not modernizing their core, which was limiting their response to the pandemic. And it kind of pandemic made these things even more clear. So as a result, what we found that companies were trying to become what we call as adaptive, creative, and resilient. And this is part of what we call as the future fit technology strategy, that firms are going to become a customer obsessed enterprise where they will try to quickly reconfigure the business concepts that they have. What are they doing in the industry? What are they doing for their partners? What are they doing for their customers, their employees? How can they quickly change in the light of the changes that are happening around them in a much more adaptive manner, in a much more differentiated manner, and with much more resiliency? So this is what the overall change that we are seeing in the industry. And why are they doing it? Because we find that future fit firms are much likely to have a better growth than the firms which are not future fit. So we surveyed close to 750 odd companies in the last 2 years ourselves. And through that research, we learned that the companies which are future fit, companies which are more adaptive, companies which are more creative and resilient, grow 2.8 times more than the industry average, the industry that they are in. So being future fit pays, right? So all those airline companies, as well as the companies in this room, who have been very resilient in last couple of years, and I'm hoping preparing yourself for the future to come. And as you look around yourself, it doesn't just apply on the end user; it applies on the tech providers themselves. How can you be more adaptive, creative, and resilient so that you can have an out normal growth? And now being adaptive, creative, and resilient means that first you need to create, you have to reimagine, you need to invest in the core architecture that you have as an organization so that you can align to a changing environment that's changing around you. So for example, when airlines realize that they cannot be the passengers plane, they can be freighters, right? Likewise, banks or other companies realizing that they cannot be what their core business requires them to do, can they do something else? Creativity is about differentiating. There's a very good example that we have in India around Cadbury's ad. If I'm not sure how many of you have seen it, what Cadbury's did in last 2 years, given that most of the interactions were digital, they were reducing, say, the OTT spend and all other things, and they invested in the digital marketing in such a manner that they leveraged the data that they had on the retailers that were selling Cadbury stores across the country, and they created these digital ads which would show up on your Facebook or whatever social media or some other online property that you were visiting in a manner that they will know what exactly is the location you are watching the ad from, and then overlay the retail store which was near to you. So this is what they did in 2020. In 2021, they actually upped the game. They one up themselves. What they did was create this interesting ad with a leading Bollywood personality, and they said that this Bollywood personality can be customized using AI to create an ad for a retailer. So if you are a retailer, say somewhere in this high HICC area, I think it's called Ijat Nagar if I'm not wrong, if you're selling a Cadbury in that shop, you can actually go to a Cadbury app and create an ad endorsed by the celebrity for your own shop. So very interesting example of how firms can be more creative. And likewise, resiliency is, of course, very well understood in terms of both security as well as infrastructure. How can you be more resilient? How can you change? How can you continue to operate even when things are falling apart around you? So those are the three things that we see are very, very important. And as a result, firms are looking to invest in three things to become adaptive, creative, and resilient. And these three things are platforms, practices, and partners. So rest of my presentation today would be about how you, as tech providers or tech service providers or tech firms or even tech consumers, how can you help your organizations build or adopt platforms so you can be more adaptive, creative, and resilient, what sort of practices you can adopt, and how you can partner. Because partnership, again, is one of the key things. And as I go further, I wanted to quickly first share what exactly is happening in the enterprise priorities, what's changing, and how does the platform partnership and practices align. And my apologies to you, I'm so used to presenting on Zoom over last couple of years, I didn't realize that the chart that I'm creating would be presented from a keynote stage. So if you are not able to see it, not a problem. I'm going to at least highlight the key things that we have here. So on the very top, what you're going to find that there are certain things that are changing very rapidly than before. Accelerating shift to digital has become way more important. The firms are attributing that this is one of the most increased priority that they have seen versus, say, growing revenue. Not to say that the growing revenue is not a priority. In fact, what this chart is trying to tell you is that while growing revenue still remains one of the key priorities, accelerating shift to digital businesses, accelerating the response to business and market changes have increased in importance for everyone, right? So just keep this in mind as as we go further. And likewise, improving employee and customer experience, changing your business model, all of these things have become very, very important in recent times. Now, for doing that, firms are looking at partners for both internal as well as external. When I say internals, I have all those GCCs who might be here in the room in mind, and as well as some other participants in an organization's transformation. So they are looking at their partners for driving their technology strategy. They're looking at their partners for driving their digital transformation, and all sorts of different technologies are becoming very, very important to use. So just remember, all of these things are going into making the firm more adaptive. And one other thing that's changing is the way they engage with partners. We are familiar with the time and materials model and the fixed price, but there are various other models that we all know that exist in between. They could actually be activity-based, things such as tickets-based pricing, or some sort of a transaction-based pricing. You could actually be more outcome-based as well, where you're looking at the business outcome, what sort of customer satisfaction that you drove, what sort of revenue growth that you help achieve your partners, to your client. So what we are finding of late, the traditional modes of, say, fixed priced or asset-based pricing, which basically is license, etc., are becoming less important compared to modes of pricing such as T&M, activity-based, and outcome-based. Just keep that data point in mind, and I'll come back to it in a minute, because I'll explain why exactly is that happening. Part of the reason it's happening is because the way firms are looking at partners is from a different lens. So if you are a service provider, if you're working with an enterprise, back in the day, they would have looked at you as a low-cost provider. They would have said, okay, you are an offshore provider. You can help me achieve certain level of cost reduction. But that changed somewhere about 6 odd years ago when they started, even there were certain leaders even 10 years ago who were looking at you as a strategic sourcing partner, but it started becoming a little bit more mainstream about in the last previous decade, where they're looking at you as a strategic sourcing partner. But of late, what we are finding that firms are looking at their partners for more co-innovation. They're looking at partners to make them more agile, to share risk with them. And these are not exclusive things. So it's not like they're not looking at you for costs. Cost is there, but they're looking at you for more sort of strategic needs, if you will. The priorities are shifting. Other thing that's shifting is the way they engage with you. So like earlier, it was mostly assets and effort based, started becoming activity based. But as you go further up, they're looking at you for more higher order values. Whether can you help manage my entire application? Can you help run my entire, say, certain process? Likewise, now they're even looking at what sort of outcomes can you drive. So there's a shift that's happening in the industry. So when you are being a partner to any organization, you have to look at what sort of shifts that are happening in the industry and how can you help them achieve the outcomes that they're trying to achieve. So if you keep these three trends in mind, one is the way the T&M and other things are becoming more important. Firms are looking at much more outcome-oriented, and at the same time, they are looking at firms to provide them lots of technology leadership. What we are finding, we are distilling that entire thought process into three key trends. And we are saying it's basically the future of partnership, which is going to become value aligned. And there's these three trends are kind of aligned to the points that I made earlier around platform, partnerships, and practices. The very first one is future fit strategy, which I talked about, will require firms to become much more as a co-innovative partner. The second, practices that they need to adopt need to be much more agile, and it will cut across the entire life cycle of any organization. And you, as partners and providers, as well as the internal enablers, will have to adopt those practices. Third, the tech that the firms will be adopting will be much more products and platform based. And I have some data points to kind of prove that. So talking about the future fit technology strategy, demanding co-innovation partnership, these will be based on three things: trust, transparency, and value alignment. I've already talked about outcome, but the trust is going to become very, very fundamental to you, because for someone to give you the benefit of being a strategic partner or someone who can work very closely with you, they'll need to be able to trust you. Are you creating right sort of conditions where that trust can be held? Are you providing enough transparency in your interaction? Because the days of the hands off relationship, not being transparent with your partners, is not going to be there anymore. And all of this will lead to firms becoming aligning their outcomes and value with each other. For example, will you be willing to commit? Will you put some skin in the game? Will you be able to commit some of your revenue at risk in case your client is not able to achieve the objective that they're looking for? And it's showing up in the data as well. We surveyed a number of service providers, I think almost 70 of them, about a quarter ago, sometime in July, August timeframe. We asked them, how much do you agree with the following statements? Again, sort of a busy slide, but what essentially they are telling us, that their clients are becoming much more outcome driven in their services engagement. They are asking for much more co-creation, much more sort of a cooperative side of engagement that they are seeking from them. So partnerships are going to become much more co-creative, much more value aligned. By value alignment, we mean that you should be able to have win-win for both client as well as the partner. Again, it's not just limited to services partner, it could be a technology partner as well, but the partnership has to be constructed in that manner. The second is around how practices will be aligning the teams on outcomes, not just on strict processes. So there was a lot of bureaucracy that used to exist in sort of waterfall model and all those things that we have evolved over the year, whether even the IT practices. But now firms are looking at much more agile, much practices which cut across the life cycle of the firm, right from figuring out what exactly is your business goal, what sort of outcomes you're going to drive, what sort of technology architecture or the business architecture you're going to be building, then what sort of processes that you'll be creating to enable the business or technology architecture, what sort of data that you will need, and then what sort of technology investment that you will be making. The entire life cycle, right from the strategy and business outcomes all the way to the technology enablement, is going to be much more agile. Why? Because if you look at across the industry, we are no longer linear anymore. Back in the day, you could get away with industry which basically started from one end, where you had raw material and you had sort of certain processes which you had to go through, and finally you had an output that you could sell to your customers. Now, firms are in a much more circular, much more sort of an ecosystem kind of a manner, where you could have multiple partners to do multiple things. And then there could be various iterations of product, could be going on, where you might require suppliers to help with your R&D or supply chain to kind of support the sort of R&D demand that you need. So the values chains are no longer linear. As a result, the whole process that I was talking about, right from strategy to data to experiences to engineering to everything, needs to be dealt with much more agility. And you as partners would be required to support your organization, your clients, as well as your internal organizations with that. The third thing that we are talking about is how services firms can be much more product and platform based. There, the role of partners would be, again, there are two types of partners here. So this is the enterprise which has certain needs in terms of what sort of programs that they need to create, what sort of outcomes that they need to drive, what strategy they need to build, how they're going to be sourcing innovation externally and internally. But at the same time, if you are a technology provider, you need to be able to cater to that need. You need to create certain collaboration, for example, with some of the other partners. You need to make your roadmap much more transparent to them, and more importantly, you need to be much more value aligned. You need to create your services, your solutions in a manner that it can be much more consumption and outcome based. And if you are a provider, your job becomes even more important, service provider that is, your job becomes even more important, because then you're looking to deliver the value to the enterprise using the partnership that you have with the technology partner, and then orchestrate that value in a manner that ultimately leads to the value for your enterprise buyer. So this ecosystem is becoming much, much more collaborative, if you will. So right from practices to partnerships, as well as the platforms that you're going to be building using whether the platforms that are provided by the cloud providers or they could be platforms that you might bring to the table. That's what's ultimately going to help enterprise orchestrate the value for themselves. So a quick recap, what we are looking at firms as they look just at the team level. Likewise, they will look at tech, which will be much more platform and product based. But I'm not done here. I'm right on time, but I was told that there's an interest in talking about metaverse here. How many of you are aware of metaverse, just by show of hands? How many of you have participated in some sort of metaverse transaction already, just by a show of hand? Very few. It's a very interesting thing. I don't know how much time do I have, but I will probably take a minute or so. So this is something that has started to come off late, and the illustration that you're seeing behind me was sort of created by a Japanese animator called Keiichi Matsuda. I hope I'm not butchering his name. So the idea and the concept has been around for some time. He created this imagery like 5 or 6 years ago. And you can see the world in which everything is sort of virtual, connected, sort of, people are participating in a virtual manner. And if I were to go by my 6-year-old kid's experience, these guys are just finding this thing to be so normal, and it can be jarring to us, but they find this thing to be so normal, they operate in it so easily with their virtual avatars and the interactions that they're having. He sometimes even plays with his sister, who is older to her, in a virtual environment. He doesn't, not in the physical setting, which I kind of sometimes worry about. But the point is, kids are becoming much, much more comfortable with a virtual environment. And metaverse is nothing but a connected, interconnected universe of universes which are completely virtual and driven by technologies such as AR, VR, sort of 3D immersive experiences, as well as enabled by technologies such as blockchain and NFTs and cryptos. You know, when you're operating in a virtual environment, the biggest thing that you need is trust. And the trust problem is today's time is being solved by things such as cryptos, NFTs, etc., where you can buy something and believe that you actually own it, and there's no other copy that's available. On the other hand, there's another thing that's happening is the experience, which is evolving rapidly. And this experience is pretty much around fooling people into believing that the virtual experience that they're having is very similar to the real world experience. So, for example, in a recent Augmented World Expo that happened recently, they had gloves which you can wear, and you can actually feel as if a pet is putting your paw on your hand. Or, for example, you can feel raindrops on your hand. So and not just feeling like this, haptic touch, you can actually, there are solutions which can make you feel the smell of the environment that you're in. You can smell roses, you can smell fire, you can smell a burnt sort of marshmallow, if you will, if you're on a camping sort of virtual experience. So all of this technology has started evolving. And as a result, there's a role for all of us to play in this, right? And technology providers like yourself will need to create solutions which can help companies participate in that metaverse. And what is the participation looking like? If you are keeping up with it, you will find that there's an environment such as Decentraland, where people are buying virtual land and putting real dollars behind it. I mean, personally, it's not for me, but if my kid grows up and the way they are valuing the virtual things, they will find it absolutely okay to put like real dollars behind some virtual piece of land. Companies such as Dolce & Gabbana and Prada and Gucci, they have been selling their fashion stuff for millions of dollars. In fact, Dolce & Gabbana recently sold a line of products for $5.7 million in virtual environments. So you can imagine how crazy this thing has become. Most likely, it's going to be given importance by the people who believe in virtual things, who kind of assign value to sort of these things. So they are going to be buying this. But as providers, what you have to do, if you are working with a high fashion retailer or a gaming company or someone else, then they will need solutions. They need capabilities, and it will not just the virtual environment. There are a ton of things that go in the physical worlds. For example, even IoT or blockchain or sort of AR, VR capabilities that you need to become very, very familiar with. And that's where the capabilities world is going to come to for us to provide them. In fact, just yesterday, it was, of course, an India-specific function, but Mark Zuckerberg, who has launched Meta recently, or rather rechristened Facebook to Meta, And as they're building the solution out, he said that India will have a significant role to play. And if India will have a role to play, I'm sure Hyderabad has a pretty good role to play in that as well. So with that, I'm going to end my presentation. Thank you for your patient listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you. Please do stay on stage. Thank you for catalyzing the thought of future partnerships and the potential of future partnerships between principals and service providers. And my mind's abuzz with all of the words that you used: digital convergence, IoT strategy, tech strategy. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm going to request Mr. Shashi Reddy to join us on stage and help felicitate you. Mr. Shashi Reddy.
Thank you, Shobha.
Managing Committee Member and VP Engineering Qualcomm.
Hi, Shashi. Yeah, thank you.
We have a memento of our appreciation from Hystia and from ICICI Bank as well.
Yeah, thank you. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Ashutosh.
everyone.